name's Ed Dorrell. I hope everyone can hear me. I am a director at an organisation called Public First, and I was until quite recently deputy editor of the Times Education Supplement. I write about much of this stuff for The Independent these days as well. This book is brilliant, and it's a fantastic intervention into an issue at a time when it is live and in the public consciousness in a way that hasn't been before. In fact, COVID has drawn back, I think, the curtains on both those overlaps that people talk about, and essentially child poverty, and it's being talked about in a way that it's never been talked about before. I think certainly in the 15 years that I've been thinking about this stuff. Anyway, we have a fantastic panel who are going to respond to Loic and to the book. In no particular order, we have got, and actually you couldn't ask for a better panel, I think, for different perspectives on this. We've got Rachel Souza, who is the incoming Children's Commissioner, who's made quite a splash on this stuff since she transitioned from running the Inspiration Trust, a MAT out in Norfolk. Emmanuel Akpan-Inwang, who is the founder and director of the Lighthouse Children's Home, which is frankly an extraordinary story, one I hope he'll tell us a little bit more about. We have Manjit, who is head of secondary at the Reach Academy in Feltham, which I suspect will need absolutely no introductions for anyone here, but has been attempting to deal with many of the issues we're talking about for a number of years. And last but not least, we have Leo and Dorea, who are two young people. And one of the fantastic things about CfEY over the years is that they always, or nearly always, try and bring young people into the conversation, people who have lived and witnessed much of the stuff that's being talked about. So, in no particular order, except the one we agreed beforehand, we're going to put Rachel Souza on the spot, who's going to respond to the book and to Loic's fantastic keynote. Rachel.
Thanks. Thank you, Ed. And great to be here. And can I first just say, Loic, that was an amazing speech, a culmination of an amazing period of years where you've been leading CfEY and this fantastic book. I read this book. I mean, Loic, as CEO of Inspiration Trust, Loic had worked with us for many, many years, helping us, and really helped us when we started our thinking about our inclusion strategy. And when I was still CEO of Inspiration Trust, he sent me his book to read and to review. And I read it cover to cover. What he didn't know was I was reading it at the time when I was deciding whether I'd apply for the Children's Commissioner's role. So it was the most amazing material to be looking at that point. And there are two, I haven't read it since, but there are two chapters that absolutely stay with me. And I want to just flag those two up. I think Alex's chapter on mental health was had a profound effect on me. I mean, we were talking about the NHS digital survey, Loic just mentioned it, where 1 in 10 young people with diagnosable mental health issues, that moving to 1 in 9. Well, we where we are now in the COVID and coming out of lockdown, we're talking about 1 in 6. Well, one of the things I've been doing is working very hard with Kevin Collins to make sure that he keeps well-being and children's mental health absolutely at the centre of the Build Back. But I think one of the most moving things about the mental health chapter was Alex's own experiences. And it's very, very powerful chapter, and I recommend everybody to read it, and I tell everyone to read it. The other thing that I really took from this book was Sam Barr's chapter looking at area-based trends. I think that's the area-based trends work is transformative when you start laying it over, thinking about disadvantage, thinking about opportunities in young people's lives. And as someone who's worked in Tower Hamlets, in Luton, in Lowestoft, in got schools in Norwich, in Cromer, I know how completely different those environments are and what that means for opportunity and for young people. So I mean, I can only recommend this book and say just how fantastic it is and how influential it was on my own thinking. In fact, as I started thinking about applying for the Children's Commissioner role, one of the things and reading this book, one of the things that struck me very deeply was, as someone who'd been involved in the education reform movement over the past 15 years, I mean, I was at Sponsored Academy I think I was Tony Blair's number 57, you know, right from those days, right the way through, leading sponsored academies, setting up a trust. The absolute beating heart of that reform movement was about overcoming disadvantage, you know, through education, and the profound belief that young people, you know, whatever their background, could you know, realize a great future and should have just as good an education as anyone else. Reading this book really brought home to me that unless we tackle these issues, unless we bring together our thinking around AP, inclusion, mental health, the whole range of issues here, we're not going to be able to move on and continue that reform. And I think the next layer of reform has to be in any of these areas that Loic has identified, and we have to bring an equal vibrancy and challenge to these areas to make a difference. So as Children's Commissioner, it's great to be here as Children's Commissioner. As Children's Commissioner, my job is to protect and promote the rights of children, of all children, and particularly vulnerable children and vulnerable groups. It's a huge privilege, and it's a huge responsibility. And coming out of COVID and coming out of lockdown, ever more so, one of the things, and I think it chimes with this book, one of the first things that I've chosen to do is to try to put it's the reason for the job, to put childhood back on the agenda in a joined up way in government. Job one, get out and ask every child in England what they think are the barriers that are holding them back as they come out of COVID, and what they need to do to have successful, flourishing, happy lives in the future. So we're launching our Big Ask survey, and you know, literally we want to. We're starting on the 19th of April, we'll be out for a month, and we want to hear from every child in England. And we're talking to children in the secure estates, children in children's homes, and indeed every child. I think there's an overarching theme about intergenerational inequality that I think we need to address. And for me, you know, I just don't think it's acceptable for children and young people to be facing a future that's less successful or worse than their parents. And I think, and the generation before them, and I think we must do everything we can to make sure that that's not the case. So following the Big Ask, we're going to be identifying the key themes in the style of Beveridge. We want a Beveridge style report. And, you know, I am absolutely certain that many of the themes that are touched on in this book will be coming through. You know, children and young people are already talking to us about mental health, physical health, community, places to go, work, possibilities for work, family strain, many of the themes that thread through Loic's book. And I really want to be able to bring together the best thinking in the area, the best innovation, to put together a joined up childhood strategy that government can accept, and that will do the things that Loic so passionately has talked to us about doing. So that's the plan. And, you know, this book was a real inspiration for that plan. So I just want to thank Loic. And my final remark really is, Loic, your powerful title, you know, about children and young people on the margins. I mean, for the job has got to be, and what we're doing today, we're bringing children and young people on the margins to the centre of our thinking today. And I want us then to bring them to the heart of government and the centre of our society. That's what I want. And I'll leave you with that thought and look forward to discussing as we go.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to hand over to Emmanuel, please.
Thank you very much, Ed. So just a little bit of context about Lighthouse. It's an organisation that's setting up a new kind of children's home based on a lot of research done in Germany and Denmark over a number of years. And I had the opportunity to speak to Loic about Lighthouse at its very earliest stages. And even back then, he was talking about this overlap and thinking about different groups of children, really informed our thinking. So a huge thank you for that. So in terms of my responses to the book, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to come here to talk about it. It is a fantastic read. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about it is the fact that it combines a very clear overview of the realities of a number of marginalised groups of children, but it does so in a way that combines a secure view of the data without losing sight of the human beings and the real individuals, the real families that are behind the statistics. And a lot of the time we can share these quite shocking statistics without realising that there are real individuals behind them. And I think going into the individual stories really pulls that into stark relief. One of the other things that I really liked about the book is it takes a rather nuanced approach to the solutions. I think it can be very easy to say that everybody is doing everything wrong. It's much harder, but at the same time, much, much more useful to offer practical solutions informed by an understanding of the root causes of the problems. And these root causes are not always obvious as well. So that was great. I was, of course, particularly interested in chapter 6 as somebody who works quite closely with looked after children and those who come into contact with social services. And one of the things that the book does well, and Loic's already pointed this out in its introduction, is really clarifying the fact that these are not always distinct and separate groups of children. So in chapter 1, you read a lot about children who are excluded, but those of us who work in the care sector know that children who are in care are also much more likely to be excluded. Children in children's homes, about 61% of them are in some form of alternative education, many of them having been excluded. I think this is further helped by moving away not just from a focus from children in care, moving away not just from a focus as to who these children are, but also why these particular things are happening. And that gives us a lot of food for thought. So I'm probably rapidly running out of time. So just a couple of things that I pulled out from reading chapter 6 and children who come into contact with children's services. Carl's story in particular is quite familiar, all too familiar for those of us who spent time working in children's homes. I meet so many capable children who have experienced huge trauma at an early stage of their life and have unfortunately been let down by our education system. And they additionally suffer from things like high turnover in children's home and a lack of consistency, constant moving. So typically children in children's homes are only in a placement for about 4 to 7 months. And many of those children are coming into children's homes traumatized by those early care experiences. But one of the things that I don't think we've really appreciated is how things like a staff turnover really compound that trauma and these experiences. One of the things that the book also highlights is that local authorities all too often see these children as dealt with if they're placed in a children's home, often to be forgotten. I'll probably also add and caveat that when it seems that children are benefiting from children's homes, I think local authorities can be too quick to move them on, often because children's homes are seen as a place of a last resort and they should be moved on to something different and something better as soon as we can. One of the things that really jumped out at me was this concept of shared care. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with Will a number of years ago, just after I got back from the children's home in Germany. And I'd also recently been to Denmark as well. What's really interesting is I was doing my placement in children's home, doing my research, came to the Friday and somebody asked if I was going to be in the following day. And I thought, well, yes, of course, I want to come in and see what the children do on the weekend. Turned up to the children's home on a Saturday morning and there were no children there. And speaking to one of the staff there, they explained that all the children had gone home to spend time with their families. And I was quite shocked by that. Of course, these children are in care. And what it highlighted to me is we have this really stark distinction. This is highlighted in the book as well, of you're either in care or you're not in care, whereas countries like France and Germany and Denmark make greater use of part-time care or shared care. And that makes the decision for children going into care a lot less seismic. So I think we really need to rethink that, and that's something that the book highlights really well. One of the things that we talk about at Lighthouse a lot is purpose. We have 4 principles: people, place, purpose, and pedagogy. So we think really carefully about the purpose of care and the purpose of children's home. Is it to be temporary refuge, an alternative to family life, etc.? I think my view is that our care system needs to be responsive to the needs of children, because different children are coming in with different needs, and there's often too much similarity actually in our care sector. And if we had more in our care sector, we had more diversity, I think that would be really, really helpful. Just a couple other things to say. This is a really great read, and it would be depressing if it wasn't for the excellent recommendations. And I think they give us a huge amount of optimism and reason to be optimistic. And it's certainly going on the reading list for all of our staff, and I'll definitely be recommending it to other people who work in the social care sector. So thank you very much.
Emmanuel, thank you very much. Really, really fascinating, and your work at the Lighthouse is really, really inspiring and well worth everyone else looking into as well, if you don't already know it. I'm going to hand over to Manjit, who is going to respond, and I imagine talk about reach as well. Manjit.
Morning, everybody. Thank you, Ed, and it's so great to be here. And I agree with all the sentiments expressed so far about the book. I actually emailed our senior team yesterday. The title of the email was urgent, which I shouldn't have done, because when the head says it's urgent, that, you know, people obviously email back immediately, but the urgency is that you need to read this book immediately. And I will recommend the staff of the school do that too. So yeah, so I'm the secondary head teacher at Reach Academy, which is an all-through school in West London, in Feltham, and I've been in post for 4 weeks. And I've been at the school since September, but I think a lot of you will already know the incredible work that we do there. We have a children's hub, which serves the community of Feltham, and we seek to provide a cradle to career pipeline of provision for children and young people, and it's a really unique feature of the school. And what we really want to do there is have a wider impact in Feltham by increasing local provision, which is accessible to all, collating services and supporting local organisations, and of course strengthening our community in Feltham. There was so much to take away from the book. I really agree with Rachel that the chapter on area-based inequalities I found incredibly interesting. And what I kind of gathered from the book is how much I need to know and how little I know as a school leader. My main takeaway from the book, which is not that revolutionary, but child poverty is really bad for children. And I've been working in areas of relatively high child poverty for the last 15 years in schools. So that point should seem quite obvious, but it's been mentioned already, it's been touched upon by the panel, that I think what we do in schools is going to deal with the consequences, whether it be poor attendance or low literacy. And actually what we really need to do is kind of break the awful hold poverty's got on too many of our young people and children around the country, and really look at why. So why has a child got low literacy? Why is their attendance poor? And I think what the book has really taught me is the underlying cause, the kind of elephant in the room, is poverty. Obviously in the pandemic, I think these barriers have been removed. So obviously we've been doing remote learning like every other school in the country. And what that's done has kind of not only brought schools into homes, but it's brought homes to us. You know, in a school, you can't really see poverty, especially with kind of school uniforms. You know, the kids all kind of look the same. But actually, when you go into their homes, and you know that we've really blurred the lines between school and home in the last year, it's been made really visible to us the challenges some of our young people face, and I think that's been a key learning point for the last year. I think also what really surprised me in the book was the chapter on social services and how old the children are who are in that provision. So I think it was 1/5 of the children are aged 16 or 17. And I think that what really struck me there is, why are we waiting until children are on the margins? And where is this early intervention that we should be intervening much earlier? At Reach, we're all through school, so from nursery all the way up to A-level. And I think there we have a really unique opportunity to intervene much earlier there. And another kind of keynote that I made reading the book in the recommendation section, and I think it came up in every single chapter, is the importance of joined up thinking and collaboration between all the sectors outlined in the chapters, and of course us working in schools. What I thought was really, really interesting in terms of personal takeaways, and I've mentioned this already, schools have really moved to a knowledge-based curriculum in the last few years. And I think as a school leader, that training around knowledge is going to be really, really key in the next few years. So that removal of kind of generic skills of school leadership, like being inspirational, rather than kind of training school leaders to be inspirational, which is not really a thing that you can do, is actually ensuring that they've got the knowledge that's outlined in this book. So I was taken aback by a lot of the knowledge in this book. And, you know, as a secondary head teacher, that should absolutely be at the forefront of my knowledge. And I actually found this actually warmed my heart, but there is no silver bullet or a single pot of money that's going to solve this problem. And I think that's a good thing. That's almost a kind of a utopia that we're always trying to reach. And actually, the recommendations outlined at the end of each chapter are absolutely workable, and solutions that schools and wider society can absolutely do. I suppose in terms of kind of my role and the role of schools, it's already been mentioned by the panel, but so much has fallen in schools in the last year, whether it be providing food, providing work, and actually our role, I think, in schools is going to be to have partnership with other schools, mental health teams, other specialist services. And I think in schools, we're always really quick to provide those services because, we got into teaching to help young people. So we're never going to say, oh no, we're not going to support you. But we've not always got the expertise and knowledge in schools. And I think what we need to do for our communities, ensure that we signpost the right services at the right time to young people and to families who might need it. And I suppose a final couple of points is the role of educational research. So I think in the last 10 years, that's been such a huge shift for us, working in schools, where we absolutely use educational research before we make any decisions. So if it's not grounded in research, I think a lot of schools now are not going to proceed with stuff that just feels good. And I think really looking into educational research into what disadvantage means in any given context. Disadvantage in Feltham looks very different to disadvantage in Norfolk or Nottingham. And I think how we use that research to inform our school development plans is going to be really, really important. And I suppose kind of the key thing I've taken away from the last year and from the book, and I said this to the children when they came back from lockdown, is I've never, ever felt that optimistic about things. I teach history, and the most common question you always get asked is, which period in time would you like to live in? So if you had a time machine, where would you go back to? And I always say the same answer, it's now. I think this is the best time to be living. And Ed touched upon it too, but I think the doors have been blown open now. The work of Marcus Rashford, for example. I've had some friends ask me, like, what is FSM? What is free school meals? And I initially found that quite insulting. I couldn't believe they wouldn't know what that is. But why would they? They don't work in schools. They weren't FSM themselves. And I think wider society has now got the knowledge of what child poverty is and what the implications are for those young people. But also, I feel really optimistic that young people will probably drive this forward in the next 15 to 20 years. In my assembly with the children, there's an amazing stat that the 10 key civil rights leaders at the end of the Second World War, their average age was 15. So they were all in school or school leavers. And I think this generation of young people will take the lead of those civil rights leaders in America and drive forward change. Like they're not gonna kind of sit there and just allow this to happen. So I'm wildly optimistic working with young people that they will deliver on this. I think we have given them the knowledge, we are the adults, but they will absolutely deliver on the recommendations in the book. So I'm so optimistic working with young people that we will absolutely have a solution to this in the future.
Manjit, thank you. And what a way to segue effortlessly into the young people on the panel, who should feel no pressure at all at this point. It's all over to you, Leo and Dorea, in your own time.
Yeah, morning everyone. My name is Dorea. I'm a year 13 student who goes to a sixth form in Tottenham, but I did most of my education in East London. And that transition that I made to like a free school that's privately funded by independent schools and private institutions really exposed me to those issues that young people face that are institutionalized, and it's sometimes even caused by these structures. And my work experience that I did at CfEY last summer gave me such valuable insight into how the process of influencing policy or lobbying government requires like research projects and roundtables and talking to and liaising with those like head teachers or young people themselves. So I'm now going to pass on to Leo, who also did the work experience, to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, so my name is Leo Hillsden. I'm a student at a sixth form in Dagenham in East London, and it's a state school, so all of these issues, I know they're not exclusive to state schools, but there's something that I personally can feel like I relate to. And in my area as well, amongst my friends, it's something that you see so often. So being here and being able to do the work experience has meant so much to actually see how there are people working for young people and seeing there are changes trying to be made in a conscious effort from youth workers and social workers and people who actually care about the younger generation. And so I'm now going to pass back to Dorea, who is going to give you an overview of her thoughts on young people on the margins.
Yeah, so what the phrase of on the margins meant to me, what I took from that was how having one tragedy or one incident happen to you, and thus not being visible in the system or not being valued, can lead certain young people down like a trajectory of having issues, and it's exacerbated by a lack of funding or poor legislation and indeed poor oversight on senior leadership teams and teachers and other people within the infrastructure of education systems and youth policy. And of course, that anything can happen to any one of us, whether you are disadvantaged or not. But it's just the differences between how the system reacts to certain young people, which is something, of course, the book touches on, and something I didn't even know in detail is groups like SEND or even Gypsy Roma Traveller young people, and how that affects them compared to someone like me or others who are quote unquote more privileged than them. And what I think is new and distinctive about young people on the margins is that emphasis of the school to prison pipeline. And just from my own knowledge, I know that's something that's very evident, say, in the US system, but it's less so spoken about in the UK. And obviously exclusions is a big topic, but the idea that it's not necessarily an inevitability that if you get excluded, you go to prison, but it's the way in which you are marginalized or the lack of care, that means that kids are almost left with no other choice. Like I know in my second school I went to, there is a handful of children now who were excluded who are now in prison, or they did a few years or a few months in prison. And I could see from reflection how preventable that was and how intervention earlier could have prevented that. Because how can someone like me end up where I am and they ended up where they are when we were both in the same school? And I also appreciate how the CfEY is both like an insider and an outsider, and how they have a particular proximity to young people and social workers and those people that work closely with us, as well as having links to like government and MPs, which I think is a unique, I guess, position to be in. And it's also reassuring for us, as Leo said, that there's people who have links and networks and are putting resources in place so that this doesn't just have to be like a reality of being a young person in Britain. And lastly, like other people mentioned, the like very intimate testimonials and experiences of young people in the book is also really refreshing to see. And it just means that we're not just statistics or like data points, that people are real and they obviously have stories to tell also. And lastly, what I think should happen as a result of what's written in the book, for me personally, the accessibility of governor boards and like councillors and the people that kind of act as checks on senior leadership. I think they need to be made more accessible to the student body, because only recently did I have an understanding that it's governors who can sort of hold like heads of departments and the head teachers and deputy heads account, because obviously if something happens to us, we're not necessarily in the position to do that. And as Mary said, at an individual level, everyone can make a difference. But I think recently, in terms of like COVID and even the rape allegations and the sexual harassment culture in certain schools, that is something that as a young person myself, it is a very difficult position to be in, to have to hold your teachers and the staff account and you don't really know where to go. So I think if there was just more transparency within like teachers and different levels of authority, I think that will give us more agency to make a difference within our schools. I'm going to pass back to Leo to give his responses on the book.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with everything Dorea said. It's so much of it is about accountability, and on the focus of the young people on the margins, the book is really good at, it creates this grey area for people. It moves away from just marginalized to completely fine. It adds this whole on the margins idea, which Dorea went into detail about, saying how they're people who are so close to being marginalized, but also aren't marginalized as a binary term. And I think it is that binary term that is so damaging, because you don't look at people who are on their way to be part of these marginalized groups or these different sort of issues. It actually looks at how to prevent them, and the detail that the book goes into it, as Dorea said, it takes away from the statistics and gives the personal accounts, give personality to these issues. And it is so clear that this is what needs to be happening. Otherwise, people just think of these as statistics that can be changed so easily and just with simple solutions. But I think the book is really in detail on how to sort out these issues, and I think it's definitely necessary for everyone. I feel like if everyone in a position of responsibility over young people and anyone in the youth sector, it needs to be read, because I think this book is so new in what it does at highlighting the issues and what can be done about it. If everyone who works with youth and has a position of responsibility over people from the youth, then they know how to deal with these issues, or at least have some sort of idea of what issues young people on the margins are facing. And I think that's one of the best things about this book. So thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat or during the Q&A portion.
Leo, Dorea, thank you so much. That was an amazing contribution, and really helped get under the cover of what we're talking about here. Really brilliant. And I've got lots of questions for you, which I will be asking you unless other people don't intervene first. As I explained in the chat, the way this is going to work is for about the next 10, possibly even 15 minutes, if I'm allowed to overrun a little. We're going to have a quick Zoom conversation. Lots of questions have been coming through on the chat. One that has got people talking, and I would like to get one or two of the panelists to respond to it, is from the fantastic Liz Robinson. So if Liz could unmute herself and very briefly explain your point about Every Child Matters.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm only 45. I kind of found myself feeling rather old as I think back to the start of my headship, 2006, when it was, the Ofsted framework, the policy of the day was Every Child Matters. And I think So I don't know. I'm interested genuinely from a policy point of view, whether we think that there were things that were not right about that. Was it that Every Child Matters just was a bad policy and it didn't work? You know, the 5 outcomes for young people, academics being one of them, but that's sitting alongside being healthy and being happy and achieving economic well-being. Lots of issues with it. How on earth do you show as a school that you're setting up young people to achieve economic well-being? Lots of challenges to it. But sitting alongside that, the extended schools model, which I think did get hijacked a bit in terms of being an extended day childcare model, but at its heart was actually about multi-agency working. And, you know, we had social worker on site. We have, that's always been my model, is you get the professionals around the child in school, in the place where children and young people and their families feel comfortable to come, and you work together. And so my question really is were they bad policies? Were there things that were flawed about that? Or is it just politics that's meant that we've moved away from that?
Brilliant, thank you, Liz. And most obvious person to go to there is Rachel.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting because I started my first headship as an academy principal in 2006 as well. So we were both there at the same time, and I would say many of those of us who were heads at that point and were engaging with that agenda were used to just thinking in that way. And certainly in terms of our my academies and the academies I've worked with and the trusts I've worked with and schools I've worked with, I think we've always realised that those other strands were supportive and sometimes essential to ensuring that academic and educational improvements could happen. What I'm really heartened to see are places like Reach, who we've had today, and other places really innovating around those strands. And what I was, for whatever reason, Every Child Matters is not part of the policy suite now, but I think we have the scope and the autonomy now as a self-improving system. And it would be great to have some fresh, innovative thinking around it, to be able to sort of revivify those areas, much like Reach is doing, in a way that works for where the context that each school is in. And I think that's the interesting challenge now, is how we can do that in a way that works for every individual school rather than a blanket policy. So you do the bits that you really need. My schools in Great Yarmouth needed something very different from, schools in Cromer, from schools in Norwich, schools in Tower Hamlets. And I think it's that sort of innovative thinking that can be done around the school. Now, it would be good, and I really want to be pushing hard to get some new and innovative policy work going in these areas. And schools are obviously going to be absolutely central to that. So, yeah.
Fantastic, Rachel. I should explain. I'm not going to put every question to every panelist, not least of all because I want to save time. But I would like to ask Manjit just to drop in briefly on that one.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It is a really unique part of the school, the Children's Hub. But actually, I suppose with all good ideas, it's not. I think what we're trying to do isn't particularly groundbreaking. I think the idea it is really, really interesting, just ensuring that our families know where to go when they need that support. And I think adult education has been a really interesting part of the hub, and we do a lot of work around adult education. I know David Thomas, I've never met, but he's a brilliant head teacher, I think, in Norwich, did a brilliant article about young people and how actually he's not worried about their exam success, he's worried about their employment opportunities, and the data around those people with the fewest qualifications get the least amount of adult training as they go on through their life. And the work we've done there has been really, I think that has been quite groundbreaking. The work we've done with adult education, offering degrees, offering courses in teaching assistants, offering courses in literacy, numeracy. So I think the work the hub is doing there has been really, really interesting. I think where I really want to see the work of the hub and the school is align more together, and that collaboration between the school and the hub I think is probably the next stage that we've got as an organisation. But yeah, it's a really creative idea, but actually what we're doing, when you look at it, it isn't this kind of big, massive revolutionary piece of work. And actually, I always think that would it be scalable for other schools to do? You know, and as I've said before, I don't think there's a silver bullet of that this is the answer, but I think we're definitely part of the answer.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to take a slightly unorthodox approach. There's lots of questions coming in, but I would like to get a little bit of conversation going around Doria's point about the exclusion to prison pipeline. And I was wondering whether I could talk Emmanuel into just talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things to say about the exclusion to prison pipeline, and I'm mostly going to talk from the perspective of looked after children. And I think one of the things that the book does talk about is, I suppose, the relationship between exclusions and then what happens at a later date. So it's not so much that children are excluded and then they are therefore going to end up in prison, but the things that impact exclusions and the things that impact your likelihood of ending up in prison are quite similar. I think the thing that's a little bit frustrating for me, particularly looking from the perspective of working in the care sector, is that much of this is avoidable. I think both around exclusions and the criminalisation of children. And I think the book takes a nuanced approach, and there are some people that say that there should be no exclusions whatsoever. And I think there are some challenges to that perspective. Some of the reasons why some of those arguments are made are because the alternative is not always where it should be in terms of alternative provision. But I think there's a lot more that can be done to support children, particularly those who are care experienced, particularly those with a social worker to support them when they're in school. We see a great deal of criminalisation amongst children who are in children's homes, partly because some of the things that you would do that you see typically amongst children, so children getting into fights or getting into trouble, are treated quite differently when you're in residential care. So it's quite common for residential care workers to call the police when those sorts of things happen. It means that children are often having the sorts of interactions with the police that they really should not be. And as a result, those children are 17 times more likely to be criminalised than other children. The book talks a little bit about the numbers of children with care experience who end up in prison. But what's really quite concerning is that 49% of our young offenders have some sort of care background. That is an absolutely shocking statistic and completely avoidable. And I think if we focus really on that space, on making sure that we are treating looked after children and those with a social worker in the same way as we treat other children, I think we'd see a significant reduction in children being criminalised, and therefore hopefully fewer lower numbers of those children ending up in prison eventually.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I'm just going to very unprofessionally ask Loic or Baz if I can keep going for another 5 or 10 minutes. Loic.
We'll give you 5 minutes. Go on, Ed.
5 minutes. Well, I mean, there's no time for this amazing conversation. I'm gutted.
The breakout rooms are going to be pretty good too. So
but this is also true. This is
we'll come up specifically in those too. So
it's not all about me. This is true. In that case, I'm going to really rather sadly, I'm going to ask Ros McMullen to quickly jump in and ask a very neat question, which is a good way of summarising this conversation. Ros.
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I haven't got my camera on, but it's just too hideous to have to see me early in the morning when hairdressers have been open. You look very glamorous, Rachel. You're laughing there, but you look much more groomed than I do, I have to say. Yeah, I was just wanting to know, really, from the panel, and this is a hard question because I don't think I could answer it. But I would just want to know what one policy change would you recommend as going to have the most positive impact for children on the margins?
Yeah, in sort of reverse order in that case, I'm going to go to Rachel.
Yeah. Oh, golly.
One thing, Rachel. 1 minute, one thing.
So I'm not exactly sure what the policy would be, but I think it's certainly around just that pre-threshold to care, the children who are sitting in all those kind of boxes, send whether it's SEND, whether it's Kids in AP, whether it's all the content of these books, just getting policy sorted so that it works around the child. And I don't know what that policy would be. We'll have to wait for the Childhood Commission, and Ros, I'll be down your way to talk about it. But I think that whole layer needs reform and rethinking and revivifying around the child.
Thank you, Rachel. Emmanuel, one thing, 1 minute.
I'm going to say something that's going to sound really fluffy, but I think it is the keen focus that we need to keep our eyes on. So the social care sector itself is quite heavily regulated. There are severe penalties for failing to adhere to regulation. And in doing all of this, I think we've created a very rigid system which has forgotten the things that really make a difference. And what children tell us makes a difference. I think what a huge amount of research points out, a lot of what I see abroad that makes a difference is relationships. And I think any policy approach that we have to take has to prioritize relationships in some ways. And I don't know exactly what that would be and what that policy would look like, but something that puts that right at the center is going to be important and potentially transformational.
Manjit.
So we're in all through school, as I've said, and I suppose if I had a magic wand, maybe making all schools all through, but if that wasn't possible, I think in that training year for teachers new to the profession or school leaders, just that knowledge of primary and alternative provision all the way through. I think in my training year, I had to do 1 day in a primary school, and that was the only experience before I got to reach of knowing what happens in those younger years, which are so critical for that early intervention. So I think something around training of that all through model would be fantastic. And if I had another magic wand, I suppose, how do you get people out of poverty? You give them some money, maybe a kind of universal basic income, and lots of interesting case studies have been done around giving homeless people lots of money and then tracking them over a 20-year period, and the percentage of those people who have not frittered the money away on different things and actually invested that money. I mean, I suppose that is maybe a utopia. That's not going to happen, but that would be really interesting to see.
Manjit, thank you. Leo and Dorea, I would like to give you the last word, if that's possible. You're very welcome to talk about a policy change if you'd like to see one, but equally, I would like to know whether you share Manjit's optimism about the generation of young people coming through and your ability to change things for the better. Leo and or Dorea.
Yeah, definitely. I think I think social media plays a big part in it, because we are the generation that has grown up around social media. We're the ones that have grown using it, and it's now a key part of our lives. Whether you see it as a good thing or not is the fact. And I think because of that, it gives us so much more of a voice to be heard. And I don't think it takes us another 15 years to have our voices heard, or it takes until we're in our adult life. I think right now we can have our voices heard. It's just that maybe not enough of the right people are hearing them and taking action with it. So I think if people in more positions of authority and the ability to change it actually listened and took action on the voices of young people, then yeah, I'm optimistic, but until that happens, I don't know how far we can get.
Thank you, Leo. Dorea, do you want to say something?
To the question about legislation, I think immediately I thought of the dichotomy between like independent schools and comprehensive and state, and like the different structures. For me, I think it might be a bit political, but I would eradicate that. Like paying for schools and private schools, independent schools. I think you can have like better or worse levels of education, I guess, but the way that people pay for schools and that incentive, I think it concentrates resources, and because of the way my school is structured, it's so visibly clear how much better they are likely to do. And yeah, I just think that's an injustice. And if it was more diverse, that you would see a difference between like the experience you have in school when you have better teachers, you have better resources, and just more money really pumped into your school. And just on that point about if we're gonna be the change, I guess. I think now we have an impetus to do so, like being COVID. So for example, like the campaign around how I think our oysters were going to be like we were going to have to pay, or they were going to take away the zip oyster card, and how like that was predominantly youth led, and that like made City overturn, or that just never ended up happening. Or even the campaigns around like sexual harassment in schools now, which I know in my school that is spearheaded by the year 12s actually. So things like that do give me encouragement that there is a possibility. I think the more that students and young people understand that it's not like, if we change the way we look at that power dynamic, that it's not just like teachers can't be held accountable, or that like they have a mandate per se where we can question them, and we're not just like pawns in a system where we're both like at the bottom and at the top. Then yeah, maybe we won't have to wait 15 years, like Leo said, that we will see change soon.
Fantastic. Look, I mean, we don't really do rounds of applause on Zoom, but if there was one, I think they'd be cheering from the rafters. Thank you so much to everyone on the panel, especially, of course, Leo and Dorrell, for your amazing insight. I'm incredibly grateful. And I'd also like to thank Loic for asking me to share. What a brilliant session that was.